What is up guys, Blue Spooky here with another 2-hour Megamix. If you guys are enjoying these super long videos and the daily uploads, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this video. If we could reach about 1,500 likes on these longer videos, that would be a great milestone to aim for. It really helps the channel to do well and ensure I can keep making these for a long time to come. If you have any thoughts about the stories in the video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about doing this is reading your guys' thoughts on the stories. Without further ado guys, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours or so of true scary stories, and I will see you guys again at the end of the video. Have a great day. I've heard dozens of stories about the dangers of online dating, whether that be looking for love or looking for something a little more casual, we'll say. I never cared much for the warnings though. Since my identity is hidden behind a computer screen, I have no problem admitting that I've been an avid user of a certain dating app for a long time, and the app I'm referring to is Tinder. I've used this app for years now, meeting women and going on a ton of dates. I'm always upfront and honest with the woman I match with on Tinder. I tell them what I'm looking for, and if they're looking for something more serious than me, no hard feelings. We end the conversation and everything's fine. A couple of months back though, I had my first real scare with the app. I got lazy and didn't care as much about being careful who I met. I matched with this beautiful girl named Teresa. She reached out to me before I could even message her. Right away, the conversation turned in a direction that, let's just say, I was looking for. Teresa didn't pull any punches at all. She was very upfront and to the point, and I liked that about her. I eventually asked her if she wanted to come over and hang out, and that's when her tone finally changed. In so many words, she basically said she didn't want to leave her house because her dog was sick and she wanted to stay with her dog. She then said she was embarrassed to have me come over because she didn't live in a great area. I reassured her I didn't care about where she lived and didn't mind at all coming over to her place. She seemed flattered and agreed to have me come over. Then she dropped a new wrinkle into the operation. You see, she said that she lived with her aunt, and that if I was going to come over, I needed to come over tonight, when her aunt was not going to be home. I should have seen all the red flags, but I did not. I was just excited to hang out with her, so I agreed to come over that night, and asked for the address. She told me that I had to wait an hour, and then I could finally come. That was certainly weird. I didn't realize that at the time though. She didn't send me the address right away, after she said to come over in an hour. She never responded actually. I asked for the address twice and never got a response. About an hour later, she finally told it to me and told me to message her when I got there. She said something about the door being stupid or something, and it would be easier for her to come outside and get me. I put the address into my phone and made the 20-minute drive to her house. She wasn't kidding about the area. It was a street of old, broken-down homes with garbage and refuse everywhere. There was one street light that worked for the entire street. When I stopped the car on the road, I messaged her right away. While I was waiting for a response, I noticed none of the houses in the area had any lights whatsoever coming from them. Most of them were boarded up and looked to be completely abandoned. It then dawned on me. I didn't even see numbers on the houses. I had no clue which one belonged to Teresa. She messaged me back. "I see you." There was a big smiley face emoji as well. I scanned the area from inside my vehicle, but I didn't see anybody. I messaged back, "Hey, can you come outside? I have no idea which house is yours." A moment later, I saw a figure come to the door of a house across the street. I couldn't see their face, but they were waving at me. I messaged her, "Is that you in the black sweatshirt?" I didn't see the figure message back to me, but I received a message almost instantly. "Yeah, it's cold here. Hopefully I'll be a bit warmer soon." She added a winking face. I turned my car off and started to get out. I saw she wasn't standing where she was a moment ago. I slowly started making my way across the street, and as I approached the front door, 2 men emerged from the driveway. I instantly threw my hands up in self-defense, but it was no use. Before I could even react at all, one of the men began beating me with a bat or something like that. The other guy just started kicking me while I was down. The person inside, who I thought was Teresa, then ran outside. Not only was it not her, it was a huge guy. He grabbed my wallet out of my pocket, and the 3 men ran down the road into the darkness. Thankfully, I'd left my phone locked in my car, and the guys didn't steal my keys for some reason. I was able to crawl back and dialed the authorities. I told them what happened. Never in my life had I felt so disoriented. Eventually, one officer basically said he couldn't do anything. The profile on Tinder had already been deleted, and since I didn't get a good look at any of them, there was no way to identify them. The only thing that really sucked about losing my wallet was replacing my ID. The joke was on them though, since they'd pretty much robbed a broke man. I think I only had $4 in cash in my wallet, and my debit card had virtually no money on it. I canceled my card immediately and went to the ER. Turns out they'd broken 2 of my ribs. I think all things considered though, I was pretty lucky that's all I walked away with. I do think about that night all the time. I can't believe how stupid I was. There were tons of red flags right in front of me, and I ignored them all for some fake girl. It makes me angry that those monsters are still out there, tricking idiots like me into similar situations. I wish I could say I learned my lesson about Tinder and meeting people online, but I did not. I'm still out there meeting new people. I'm just extra careful now and using my head more often. You can never be too careful when it comes to online dating. I'm from South Africa, and most of my family still lives there. It's a really gorgeous country with some of the most stunning natural beauty imaginable. Some of the best food you'll ever eat, too, and some of the friendliest people you'll ever meet. Any Afrikaans viewers will be able to vouch for South African hospitality. Unfortunately, it's also one of the most dangerous countries in the world, for residents and tourists alike. The majority of the population lives below the poverty line, and the education system is in real bad shape. Petty to moderate crime is basically a way of life, with very few consequences at all. Crime there also tends to be particularly needlessly violent, often escalating to assault, indecent assault, and even murder. No one has any faith in the police, who are often corrupt and incompetent themselves. The people live in a constant state of heightened awareness and paranoia. It's not really something you even notice about yourself, that underlying tension, until you spend a little bit of time somewhere else. You realize that while you're away, you've stopped holding your breath. Every building has bars on the windows, every business has security cameras and guards, and every home, even the most modest ones, have an alarm system and panic buttons. Most cars have a tracking device installed. This is the normal I grew up with, and even though I had been the repeated victim of pickpocketing, car thefts, and one attempted hijacking and burglary at my mom's house when I was a kid, I figured that was what life was like, and I didn't consider it strange. It was at the age of 21 that I met my future husband, Carl. We didn't exactly waste any time. We had a real whirlwind romance. A few months after we started dating, we had rented an apartment together, and within 6 months we got engaged. We moved from the city to a small house in Cape Town, almost on the opposite side of the county. We were married another 6 months after that, and I was working as a graphic designer. Carl got a job as a programmer. Carl and I were both used to a certain amount of crime being part of daily life in Pretoria, like I've mentioned. Things were no different in Cape Town, of course. The place where Carl worked was robbed in broad daylight, and a bunch of his valuables were stolen right out of his office. My workplace was also broken into twice in a 3-month period. Once when a couple of ladies were still in the building at night, and we had to hide in a bathroom. One night, after getting off work very late, I was followed by a car with tinted windows, and whoever it was tried to run me off the road. I did everything you're supposed to do in that situation. I didn't stop at red lights, slowed just enough to check for cars before speeding through, and made random turns. I floored it and then finally turned into the nearest police station. It worked, and the car sped off right after I pulled in. My car's window got smashed in our driveway one night while we were asleep. Obviously, I didn't keep anything of value in there, but it didn't stop whoever it was from trying. It turned out every car on the street not in a garage had been smashed into that night, probably by the same group of thugs. These are just a few examples of a very long list. If things hadn't escalated from here, who knows how long we would have continued to live there under that state of normal. During the early hours one Saturday morning, maybe around 4 a.m. or so while it was still dark, I was woken up to the sound of a loud pop, like the sound of a light bulb exploding. I shook Carl awake and asked if he could hear anything. While I was still whispering that I'd heard a strange noise, our bedroom door creaked open and beams of flashlight shined into our eyes. Carl shouted something, and I let out a scream. Our bed was surrounded by 3 men. They ordered us to get out and just kept telling us to shut up and be quiet. Carl was in his boxers, and I in a t-shirt. I thank God we don't sleep naked. I don't remember what we said to them, but I remember feeling strangely calm. One man began rummaging through our closet. Another left the room to ransack the rest of our home. I remember having my wedding ring pulled off my finger, and the same being done to my husband. We were forced into the bathroom and made to climb into the bathtub. One of the men made us sit back to back before tying our wrists together. I knew anything of value we owned was about to be gone and that we might die. I still pleaded with the men not to take our wedding rings, to take anything we had, but to please give the rings back. I guess they just meant so much to me as a newlywed in that moment. He seemed eager to keep me quiet. He kept pointing the knife at me, saying, Okay, we'll give them back. Just shut up already. He told us to stay there and not to move, then locked us in the bathroom. We stayed there in silence for a while, listening to the commotion in our house. When it sounded like they were gone, Carl worked his hands free and broke out of the bathroom, then hit the panic button in our bedroom. That set off the house alarm and an emergency alert to the local police station. It was starting to get light outside. As we looked around the house and waited for the police to arrive, we realized the place was an absolute mess. Drawers and cabinets pulled open and emptied all over the floor. In the spare bedroom we used as a home office, everything of value was totally gone, except for my enormous iMac, my pride and joy at the time, which was laying face down on my desk after its cord had been cut. We couldn't figure out why they hadn't taken it. We realized that cut must have caused the electrical popping sound that woke me up in the first place. Us waking up must have interrupted their little mission. The scumbags were actually caught in the end. We were so afraid of something like this happening to us again that we slept in shifts from then on. Every little sound put us on high alert, and I kid you not, 2 weeks later, one night while we were in bed, Carl heard voices on the other side of the wall surrounding our small yard. And peering out the window, we saw the tops of 3 shadowy heads moving toward the neighbor's wall. We called the police, and not long after, we had the satisfaction of seeing the men who'd invaded our home being arrested on the street. That was enough for us. We set things in motion to get the hell out of Dodge. 10 years later, we now live in the USA in Tennessee. We have 2 beautiful little girls. I really wish I could recommend South Africa to tourists, but we never plan on even taking our kids there to see where we grew up. It's just not worth it. We're really lucky the scum who robbed us weren't looking for violence that night. By the way, we never did get our rings back. I'm at work right now, so I'll keep this pretty brief. Today, I was reminded of something very creepy that happened in my office. It all happened about 5 years ago. It was right when we moved into the building. I've got to say that from the moment before I even got my desk all set up, I just felt something off about this place. Let me try to explain what I mean. The first thing I noticed was that the elevator seemed like it was much too modern for the building. It was really high-tech compared to everything else there. In the bathroom, there were also sensor-activated lights, which seemed out of place too. I don't know how to explain it. It was like there was efforts made to replace individual things and not renovate the entire place. The interior didn't match the exterior. It was just kind of weird. I could sense that a lot had happened in this building. It had been the offices of multiple businesses in the past. I had to do quite a bit of overtime in the coming days after we moved into the new building. I was always fine with doing overtime though, so I didn't really mind to be honest. This was something else though. It was more than I'd ever done before. I guess I wasn't very good at listening to my body at the time, because looking back on it, I was really overworking myself. It wasn't just work though. Every time I finished late, I stayed up even later. I was surviving on less and less sleep. I would stay up late because I needed to eat, shower, and try to mentally switch off for a little while. One day during this busy period, I felt some incredibly intense stomach pains at work. I had been feeling rough and worn down, but the stomach pains were a new thing for me, a new, very concerning thing. I decided to make use of the bathroom on the second floor. That was the more modern of the 2 bathrooms. Normally, the bathroom lights are usually on, but they were off that time. I guess because it was a weekend. Yep, I was at work on a Sunday. It was a dark day. I remember it being in the late stages of autumn, the kind of day where it gets dark out very early. It was a little eerie, but as soon as I went in there, the sensor light picked up on my movement and lit up the whole bathroom. I really shouldn't have been in the office over the weekend, but I was. I had a big project presentation coming up that I needed to work on, probably why I was having those stomach pains. My stress levels were very elevated. I pushed open the stall door and got the shock of my life. There was already someone in there. I had never seen them before, and they certainly didn't work in the office. I was so stunned I almost forgot about my stomach. He had white hair and seemed kind of old. I remember he was wearing a shabby shirt. He stood with his back facing me. My brain went on autopilot, and I remember blurting out something like, "Oh, sorry." It was like I was so embarrassed to see someone in there. I didn't really question it in the moment. I just slammed the stall door closed and darted out of the bathroom. I headed up another flight of stairs to use the one on the 3rd floor. My initial thought was that whoever I ran into the bathroom must be doing overtime as well. Halfway up the stairs, though, my tired and confused mind threw up a question that really woke me up. The question cut right through me. If someone was in there, why was the sensor light off? Why didn't it detect his motion? The light usually stays on for ages when someone goes in there. I didn't understand. I wondered if there had been some kind of malfunction with the light. I went home, and nothing else happened that day. Whoever was in the building at the same time as me came and left without my knowledge. Flash forward a couple of days, or maybe even some weeks, I uncovered some disturbing news. There were rumors about our new building circulating around the office. The rumor I heard was there was an elderly person who had collapsed and died in this building due to overwork. They said he had collapsed in the bathroom, and that's why the previous occupants had left. Ever since I heard that rumor, I haven't been able to go anywhere near the bathroom I saw that old guy in. I've been trying to convince myself he was nothing more than a figment of my imagination, a hallucination conjured up by an overly tired mind. I tried to tell myself that's what that was I saw that day, rather than something completely paranormal. I just can't shake the feeling it was something more than that, though. Perhaps if the rumors were true about the old man dying due to overwork, then the reason I saw him that night might have been him giving me some kind of grim prediction of what's in store for me if I carry on with overworking myself. I can just imagine him in the bathroom, hyperventilating, sweating, and shaking like me. It made me realize I really have to listen to my body more often. Since I saw that man, I've taken little steps to back away from all the overtime, but it's a bit tough. I always use the restroom on the 3rd floor now. This is something that happened back when I was about 10 or 12 years old. I'm an adult now, so it was a long time ago. I still think about it sometimes. That's how weird and scary this situation actually was. To start out, I will mention this was sometime in the early 2000s or so. Cell phones weren't the most common back then. My parents did have them, but it was far more common to use our home phone, which was connected to our household landline. I think we had 2 or 3 of them. The main one was in the kitchen, and there was another one in the living room as well. We didn't have any caller ID back then, so when a call came in, you wouldn't know who it was unless you answered. I was an only child, so I didn't have any siblings. One night, my parents left to go shopping, and I stayed home because I wasn't interested in going. I would go with them about half the time, but most of the time it would just be really boring. My parents would leave me home by myself all the time for small trips and things like that, so I was somewhat used to it. That night, about an hour after my parents had left, I was in the kitchen when suddenly the phone began to ring. I figured it was most likely my parents calling, so I picked up the phone and answered. "Hello?" I expected to hear my mom's voice responding to me, but it was not my mom at all. It was a man's voice. It sounded really weird too. Definitely was not my dad. The man on the other end spoke very slowly and asked me who I was. I was kind of creeped out, but I figured the person must be calling for one of my parents. Because I was so caught off guard though, I couldn't really think of anything to say, and just hung up the phone right then and there. Afterward, I went back to whatever I was doing. I don't remember a whole lot of the rest of the time my parents were gone that night. I do know that when they came home, the guy hadn't called back or anything. Only a few days later though, the guy called back again. This time, my parents were asleep in bed, and I was up late watching some TV. It was a Friday night, so I didn't have school the next day, and could stay up however late I wanted. I'm guessing it was around 11 p.m. or so, when I heard the phone start ringing. It was really strange. We never got phone calls this late at night. I wondered who it could possibly be, but I had no intentions of answering it. I wasn't the type of person to answer the phone unless my parents were gone or I was expecting a call. I let it continue to ring as I continued watching TV and sitting on the couch. The living room phone was just a little ways away from me, and after the phone stopped ringing, I heard a beep. I could tell somebody was going to leave a message. When somebody left a voicemail back then, you could hear it in live time as they recorded it. When I heard the person start to speak, I felt instantly creeped out. It was the same man as before, speaking in a deep and slow voice. "Hi, I thought you were home tonight." There was a little pause before he hung up. I wondered who this guy was. Sure, I didn't know all the people my parents did, but I was really close with them. If they had talked with this guy on the phone before in the past, I feel like I would have known. Why was he calling so late at night anyway? I went over to the phone, which now had the flashing light showing there was a new message. I played it back once more, just to make sure I was not imagining things. It was certainly very strange. I only stayed up for a little bit longer that night, before going to bed. The next day, I'd completely forgotten about the strange phone call, and so I did not tell my parents. Later that night, we were all at home and in the living room, when the phone began to ring once more. It was late again, after 9 p.m. or so. My mom walked over and answered the phone. I really didn't think too much of it, until my mom hung up the phone immediately. She hadn't even said anything. She walked back over and said when she answered the phone, she heard nothing. Then whoever was on the other end hung up. My dad suggested it was probably a wrong number, but that's when I remembered the strange phone calls I'd been receiving. I told my parents about them. They were completely unaware of who that could be. We played the message from the previous night, and all found it very strange. All we could assume was it was someone who had the wrong number, or some kind of creepy prankster. That night, we didn't get any other calls, and we didn't receive any further for about a week or so. In that time, I basically forgot about it again. One night, though, I happened to be staying home alone once again. I think my parents were out shopping, but I can't remember exactly. It was dark out and I was in the living room when the phone began to ring. I heard the man's voice again. He started to say something, but I slammed the phone down on the receiver. I was too creeped out to listen to whatever this guy had to say. Moments later, the phone began to ring again. I just knew it was him calling back. On the slim chance that it was actually my parents, they could just leave a message. When the phone stopped ringing, I started to hear the man's voice again, leaving a message. He said he could see I was home right now. This was really weird. How could he really know that I was home alone? I went over to the window and opened up the curtains a little bit. I looked out onto the street and saw there was a suspicious car parked on the side of the street a little ways from our house. It was unusual for any cars to be parked there. I couldn't tell who was inside or anything else. The engine was on though, and the car was running. I watched for 10 or 15 seconds, and it didn't move at all. Was this possibly that man? After seeing this, I ran to the phone and called my mom on her cell phone. I told her what was happening, and she said she would head home immediately. I was too afraid to look out the window again. I hid behind the couch until my parents got back home. They arrived 10 minutes later, and when they did, the car had already fled from my street. I'm not sure where that guy went. I was just happy he was gone. After this happened, my parents didn't leave me alone for a long time. Everywhere they went, they insisted I come with them. We also unplugged our home phone for about a month or so. When we finally hooked it back up, whoever that guy was didn't call again. I don't know for sure if it was actually him parked on the side of the street, but I have a strong feeling that it was. I also don't know who that guy was or why he kept calling us. I grew up taking regular vacations with my family. Now that I have my own family, I like to keep that tradition alive. Every summer when my kids get out of school, we take a trip somewhere. We don't usually drive more than 8 hours, and more often than not, we'll stay in one of the coastal cities, since we live on the East Coast. The specific year my kids turned 7 and 8, my husband and I figured they were mature enough to drive through the night. This day, we could arrive at our destination in the morning and not waste an entire day driving. We started the 8-hour drive to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina at around 11 o'clock at night. After stopping for bathrooms and gas, we planned on arriving at our destination around 7 in the morning. The plan was that when we arrived, we would take an hour or two nap and then spend the rest of the day at the beach. However, we almost didn't make it to Myrtle Beach at all. At some point during the night, it started to downpour outside. It was raining so hard, it was almost like driving through a snowstorm. You literally could not even see 2 feet in front of you, not to mention it was pitch black on the highway. Add those two together, and you have a very dangerous drive. I was starting to notice that my husband was kind of swerving back and forth a little bit. Thankfully, the girls were sleeping, because I wouldn't have wanted them to see me like this. I was a wreck during this part of the drive. After some quiet arguing, I finally convinced my husband to pull over and wait out the rain. I could tell he was really annoyed because he just wanted to get there. He hated it when he was behind schedule. Our family's safety was more important, though. He realized that eventually. While we were parked, I suggested we switch spots and told him that while it was raining, he could shut his eyes and take a nap for a little while. I told him if it stopped raining, I would drive to the nearest rest area, and then we could switch back. Within seconds, he was already snoring. I put my headphones on and started to listen to an audiobook while I waited out the rain. I would occasionally lift my head up and look around to see if the rain had subsided, but it seemed like it was never going to stop. While I was sitting there, I noticed a light in the rearview mirror. They were those super bright halogen lights. They seemed even brighter as they reflected off the rain. I knew it wasn't a cop or anything because I didn't see any flashing lights. I made sure the doors were locked just in case and continued listening to my book. I honestly didn't think anything of this vehicle with bright lights. It now slowed down and eventually parked right behind us. I just assumed that whoever this person was, they were doing the same thing we were doing. 10 minutes passed by, and the lights behind me turned off altogether. That alerted my attention, and I looked up at the rear-view mirror. I could see the vehicle was still there, because my red flashing hazard lights were still lighting up some of the area behind our vehicle. I was trying to see if I could make out any details of the driver, but the rain was coming down too hard. As I was looking, I noticed the door of the vehicle quietly whip open. My heart started to race. I was thinking about what I would do if someone walked over. My worst fear was becoming a reality. A huge person seemed to emerge from the driver's side. I continued to look in my rearview mirror as the person started to approach our vehicle. I turned on our car just in case. As the car turned on, the man was now standing right next to my window. He lightly tapped on the window and gestured for me to roll it down. I cracked it open and asked if I could help him with something. In a deep voice, the man said, "Oh, yeah, my car broke down. I need a ride down to the gas station. Think you can help me out?" I told him I would call the police, and they would be able to help him. I pointed to the back seat and told the man I had my kids back there, and there wasn't any room at all. The man bent down and looked into my vehicle. As he looked into the back seat and saw my 2 sleeping children there, he said, "Oh, you have children. Never mind then, ma'am. You have a good night there." He walked back to his vehicle, and I kid you not, he just drove away. His car was not broken down at all. He lied to me in order to gain access to my vehicle. I was sick to my stomach, thinking about what reason he could have had for doing this. I shook my husband immediately and told him what happened. We decided to call the police. I didn't really know what to say other than that it was a very suspicious encounter. I told them it was a black truck, but that was all I could really tell in the rain. The cops kind of brushed off what I said, since I didn't really have any evidence, and the guy technically didn't do anything wrong. I was just worried that whatever intentions this man had, someone else may fall victim to his game. Not long after speaking with the police, the rain subsided, and we continued with our trip. We decided not to tell the girls about the strange man, because we didn't want to freak them out before the vacation had even started. This was a few years back now, and I still haven't told the kids. I plan on telling them someday, but right now I just want them to enjoy life and not worry about all the creeps in the night. I grew up in a very poor rural family. Even though we lived out in the country, there's one thing I'll always remember my family telling me. If you see anything weird when you're out there in the country, it's best to avoid it altogether. There are some really weird and dangerous people out there, and it's best to leave them to their own devices. I didn't really give it much thought when I was younger. My dream back then was to be an FBI agent, and if there was trouble, I always felt like law enforcement could handle anything. I guess maybe I just didn't think there might be some things they didn't want to put their noses in. This isn't about law enforcement or anything, though. It's about a scary experience a friend and I had while we were out exploring one time. We were teenagers at the time this happened, about 16 years old or so. My friend Joey actually saw our explorations out into the woods as hunting. He would always take his rifle with him when we went exploring. I almost never shot at anything, though. I think he was one of those guys who really just liked his gun and liked having it with him when he was out in the woods. Once he had a car, we began taking much farther trips out into the countryside. There was never any traffic on these old hill roads, so we could park right by the side of the road and go out and explore without worrying about the car. We would find new places to go and check out, and many of these took us pretty far from home. We were driving way out because we were pretty curious to see something entirely new. Joey was talking about hunting squirrels or something, but I had never seen him even take a shot at a squirrel. I didn't think he was that serious. We didn't know the area we arrived at. In fact, the dirt road just ended altogether. There was a gate at the end of this road, but we didn't know the purpose of it. Mind you, there wasn't a fence around to keep you out of the woods, just a gate that clearly showed the end of the road. We decided to park there, get out, and look around. If you've ever lived out in these areas, you'll understand the sort of area we were in. There hadn't been any houses on our way for a while, although we did pass by several driveways that led off to places we couldn't see from the main road. These would have been the really rural people who probably did hunt to get all their food. As usual, we didn't know what we were looking for. We were just looking, really. Joey had his rifle with him, of course, but we always hoped we would find something interesting. In the past, we had stumbled across waterfalls, creeks, old buildings, and things like that. I guess deep down, I always hoped to find something historical, like an Indian burial ground or something left over from an old war. Of course, I hadn't yet come across anything like that. The area we were in was pretty damn cool, though. It was thick with trees and brush, and you really had to be careful where you were walking. There were all these thorny bushes that really sucked when you got a vine or something stuck in your pants. Joey kept telling me he was hearing some strange noises off in the distance. He thought it sounded like some sort of engine running or something. I didn't really hear it, but I could hear something. I told him it might have been someone living down the hill or something, but since I couldn't make out the sounds very well, it must have been someone quite far away. There were other noises that both of us could hear, though. Mostly what sounded like animals. It really looked like there were no traces of human life anywhere around us. That got my hopes up that I was going to come across something different, something new. I wasn't really sure how long we'd been out there without coming across anything interesting at all. That was when I guess Joey started getting bored with what we were doing. He took a few shots toward where he said he'd seen some squirrels. Again, for anyone worried about it, Joey never really shot anything. I believe he would have freaked out if he killed anything. Not long after he made those shots, though, I noticed something out in the woods. It wasn't off in the direction of where he'd been shooting, though. At first, I was just hearing some sounds, but then I noticed some movement and thought I saw someone moving around in the woods. Joey wasn't far from me, so I called him over. I mentioned that I thought I could see someone in a tree, and for him to come take a look. It would have been weird to come across anyone that far out in the woods, so naturally I was a little worried. When Joey came over, he noticed it too. He was mildly worried, trying to act macho with his gun. He kept holding it in a weird defensive posture, telling me not to worry if anyone really was out there. That's when I heard the sound of a motor trying to start. We saw a figure emerge from the trees. It was a pretty big man who looked like a hillbilly from hell. I don't know how else to put it, since I'm not the best at describing things. He looked like he probably hadn't had a shower in years, nor had he ever shaved in his entire life. He was walking pretty slowly in our direction, and had an obvious limp as well. He was dragging something on the ground with his right hand. "You been shooting on my property?" he yelled at us. "You been shooting on my land?" Joey just stood there and dropped his hand that was holding the rifle. It was then that we noticed what the man was holding, and we knew what noise we'd been hearing that day. The man had a chainsaw. "Don't be shooting on my land," he yelled at us as he tried to start it up. It took him a few tries, but he got it done and it roared to life. Joey looked too shocked to move. I grabbed him by the arm and told him we should run right now. Some readers may think I should have told him to just shoot the guy, but like I mentioned, I don't think Joey would ever do that, and I didn't want to have to resort to that either. I finally got him to turn and run off with me. We're fortunate that the guy hadn't been able to chase us very well before we started running. He had a limp and was carrying that chainsaw, which made it quite hard for him to run. The whole thing was very scary though, because he did start limp rushing in our direction. It was hard running through the woods. We got caught by thorns and burrs and all other sorts of things, but that didn't matter much while it was happening, because what we had seen after us, we just wanted to get back to the car. It was a horrible run, and we were both bleeding by the time we got back. It was a real bitch to get it to turn around too. When we did get it turned around, I looked to the side and saw the man out there in the woods. Fortunately, we were already in the vehicle and drove off scared half to death. We told my parents the story and were quite surprised by how they didn't really find it that odd. They told me it was a hermit who didn't want someone hunting on his property. Must have been cutting firewood when he heard the gunshots go off. They weren't surprised he chased us with a chainsaw either. People out there do some weird stuff, and it's best to just leave them alone. Around a year ago, my friend Ruth and I had been out looking at houses that we liked the look of, as we planned to live together and wanted to get a feel of what the areas felt like, especially late at night. I'm from a small town, while she had been living in the city, attending uni about an hour's drive away. For context, it was around 2 a.m. or so, and as we were driving along the main road that led to the entrance of town, we realized a yellow car full of men had been following us for quite a while. We didn't think much of it at first, but naturally it really creeped us out. We sped up, but so did the yellow car. By this point, we were low-key beginning to panic, as we didn't want to take them straight to my front door. Once we reached the entrance to my town, we tried taking random turns, just in case it was paranoia. We also wanted to see if they would get fed up and just leave us alone. Well, of course they did not. By this point, we had been driving around for a good 30 minutes or so, and we were quickly losing fuel. The plan had been to fill up at the gas station, but as we were currently being followed, neither of us felt safe enough to get out of the car to do so. We felt we had no choice but to head back towards my house. I called my dad in hysterics and told him to come walk us up to the front door. Neither of us felt it would be a good idea to have Ruth fill up her car and drive home alone. She never drove up the hill leading to my house, as it's very steep, but on that day we had no choice. If we entered the car park, we would have been trapped by that yellow car, but we still had no clue what their intentions were. Luckily, once they saw my dad, they drove off right away. Realistically, we should have just called the police. But in our minds, we were really afraid of what they might think, as we were just two young girls driving around in the early hours of the morning. Luckily, I haven't seen that car since then, but it still makes me worry to this day. What were their intentions? Was it just a little fun trying to scare some young girls, or were their intentions much more sinister? That's a question I'll never have the answer to. This is something that happened when I was a kid. I lived with my parents and my younger sister at the time of this story. I was around 12 or 13, I believe, and the neighborhood we lived in had a little bit more land. The backyards of all the houses were really large, but the houses were still fairly close together. I knew a few of the neighbors, but didn't know any of them super well. There was one house close to us that was next door to the west. Both our house and theirs had decks in the back, and the one next door was kind of small. I remember I would go outside in the backyard a lot, because I was a kid, and I liked to practice playing sports back there. I remember that I went outside one time and saw the woman who lived next door out on her deck. She was pretty far away, and it was kind of hard to see, but it almost looked like she had a pair of binoculars and was looking right at me with them. This seemed a little bit strange for sure. I think it was just her and her husband who lived next door, and they didn't seem to go outside much at all. We rarely ever saw them, and they also didn't seem very friendly. I know that every Halloween we would go to their house, and they would never answer the door. I tried to ignore what appeared to be her looking at me, and just kept doing what I was doing. I think I was practicing some frisbee golf shots or something like that. I looked up a while later and saw she was still there, facing me with this pair of binoculars in hand. It seemed so strange that I just stopped and stared at her to see if I was really seeing this correctly. She didn't move at all. The woman was just steps away from the door to go back inside. I went back to what I was doing and looked again a few minutes later. This time she was actually gone. I was pretty glad to see that. I stayed outside for a while. Back then, I was basically outside every day. I'm not sure if it was the next day or a few days later though, but I soon saw her again. This time I was in the backyard once more, but the woman was inside of her house. She was at the window. I don't know which room it was in exactly. It was somewhere on the second floor that looked out to our backyard. I'm not even sure how I noticed this, because it was kind of hard to see. Once again, she had a pair of binoculars and appeared to be watching me with them. Now, our backyard wasn't that interesting. I had no clue as to why she would be looking out into it with a pair of binoculars. If she was watching me specifically, I found that very odd. I stopped what I was doing and stared at her again. I wasn't necessarily mad or annoyed with her. I was more just confused. I wanted to know what was going on. Why was she watching me? She stayed there staring at me, and I stared back at her. She barely moved at all. This went on for about 5 minutes. When I finally saw her move out of the way of the window, I went back to playing in the yard. Each time this happened, I never told my parents or anybody else about it. It didn't seem like that big of a deal to me, and by the time I would come inside, I would usually have forgotten all about it. A while after this, maybe a week or so later, I don't really know, I happened to be outside pretty late at night. It was around 11 p.m. or something. It was summertime, so I would usually stay up later. This also meant it was pretty nice outside. People were using both of the bathrooms we had in our house at the moment, and I really had to go. Being a guy, whenever this happened, I would sometimes just go out in the backyard into the woods, even though it was really late at night. I went downstairs and then went out the back door to the backyard. I was going to go behind a tree and do my business, but before I even got the chance to walk out to the tree, I saw something strange. I looked over and noticed the woman stepping out onto her deck. She then put the binoculars up to her face and appeared to start watching me. She was literally right outside the door leading to their deck, this late at night. It was really odd. I turned around and ran back inside. It creeped me out. All I wanted to do was use the bathroom. After that, though, there was no way I was going outside. Somehow, I still forgot to tell anybody. I'm not really sure how I did. It just happened. That night, I went to bed. My bedroom happened to be down in the basement of our house. It was a split level with 2 bedrooms upstairs and 2 bedrooms downstairs. My bedroom was partly underground and had a window that looked outside. After going to bed, I fell asleep rather quickly. At some point, though, I woke up. When I did, I just remember I could tell it was in the middle of the night. I heard a noise coming from my window and looked over. I was expecting to see nothing. Maybe a big bug flying against the window, with it being summertime and all. But what I saw instead was the woman literally standing right outside my window, looking in at me. It was the craziest sight I'd ever seen. I'm pretty sure I rolled off my bed to the other side away from the window. I hid behind it. I didn't want to look back at her. I stayed there for a while, and when I was finally able to look up again, she was gone. I went upstairs and told my parents about everything. The next day, my dad went over to confront them. Her husband answered the door and denied everything. He said we were crazy, and the husband was really mad about the accusation. My dad ended up cursing him out and then leaving. The woman never came to the door. After that confrontation, she never did anything strange like that again. I did see her a couple of times, but she wasn't doing anything weird when I did. Those people moved away a year later, and a whole new family moved in. I still think about how bizarre that situation was, though, sometimes. I, 7 at the time this happened, and my best friend, who was 8 at the time, who I'll refer to as A, used to have a day in the week, Wednesdays specifically, when I went to A's house after school for about 4 hours. I'd have dinner there and then go home. A's mom, we're Australian by the way, didn't have a job at the time, so when we walked to her house, she'd always be there when we arrived. On this specific day, however, she just so happened to be out. I can't remember exactly why, since this was many years ago now. There was this guy I remember. He used to watch young girls at pickup time. He'd just stand there alone with this creepy hoodie pulled over his head. My school had kids of all genders, from ages 5 to 12, but he only ever watched the young girls under 10. Was a young guy, too, maybe only 19 or 20. I never really paid much attention to him. I thought maybe he was an older brother or something of one of the kids there. On Wednesday, A and I got out of our class, and she reminded me I forgot my drink bottle on my desk in the classroom. I went back in to go and get it. The huge swarm of kids had dwindled slightly by the time I got back, but there were still a lot of kids around. My school only had about 400, but it felt like a lot. All the kids who got picked up by car were mostly gone now, and the ones that rode their bikes were gone as well. It was mostly just us kids who walked that were left. A's house wasn't that far away. It took less than 10 minutes to get there usually. We used to get distracted by some of our other friends who we passed when walking there. For context, these friends were all our age and were all boys. A and I started walking home, and it was completely normal at first. Nothing really seemed off at all. We crossed the first road and started laughing as I jumped along a brick wall and started walking across it. I was going a little slow, so A waved her hand at me and beckoned me to go faster. I jogged a bit, with my big clunky backpack weighing me down, and caught up to her. We crossed a very large road, and it wouldn't be long until we were at A's house. Just turn a corner, walk a bit further, and it was right there. We turned the corner and started walking the short distance. That was when I turned around, because I heard a car slowing down. That's when I saw that man, walking about 20 meters behind us. His hood was pulled all the way over his head. At first, I didn't think it was too weird. Maybe he just also had to go this way. When I looked at him, though, he immediately stopped walking and stood in the middle of the footpath. I told A this was really freaking me out. We started to walk faster. We got to her house and thought it was a funny little incident. We looked out the window and saw he was still standing back where he'd stopped earlier. He must have seen which house we went into. A's family made us take off our shoes and socks and leave them out on the front porch. We'd done that before we opened the door and went inside. Usually we only shut the flywire, seeing as A's mum was there, but today we closed and locked the second door too. I'm really glad we did. We decided to go play video games in the front room. The blinds were down and we were sitting on the couch. 15 or so minutes must have passed by when there was a tiny knock at the door. We were smart kids and knew not to open it. A's mom would just unlock it and come inside if it was her. A decided to peek out the blinds though. She said it was some random guy, thought it might have been a salesman. I took a look and noticed it was the same guy from before. The knocking gradually got louder until he was pounding on the door like he wanted to break it down, and the door handle began jiggling. We were insanely scared. We hid between the wall and the back of the couch. The guy left after a little while. Maybe 10 minutes of attempting to get inside. When A's mom got home, we didn't tell her. We didn't realize how serious it was. When it was time to go home and my mom had arrived, I went to put my shoes back on. It was only then that I realized both mine and A's socks were gone, taken out of our shoes where we had tucked them. This is the weirdest thing to ever happen to me, but I swear it's true, and for the life of me, I've never been able to explain it. My grandma and grandpa lived in a holler way out in the country. Whenever I would visit, I would love to just go hiking and see what I could find. One day, when I was a teenager, I was there and had been out hiking for quite a while. There was a river that I normally followed, so I wouldn't get lost. On this day, I strayed away from the river and found an old abandoned dock in the middle of nowhere. It was falling apart and looked like it hadn't been used in ages. It made me start to wonder if maybe there were some old campgrounds in the area. So I started moving away from the river and looking to see what I could find. Eventually, I came across what appeared to be an abandoned summer camp. Although there weren't any standing buildings, I did find a few foundations that had survived. I wasn't sure how old the place had been, but it must have been abandoned for a very long time. That was truly the coolest thing I had ever found when I was out and about. As I was walking around this camp, I noticed an old well set a ways off from it. I had always been a bit scared of wells. The thought of falling down in one had always been a terror that I had. I really had no idea how it developed, honestly. Teenagers are also fascinated by things that scare them, though, so I thought I would go and check it out. The well wasn't covered at all. I peered down into it. I thought it might be cool to call down and hear my voice echo back. I tried that, and I did indeed get a good echo. However, It was what happened after the echo that really frightened me. I heard another boy's voice answer back to me from inside the well. The voice called out for help. To make sure I wasn't hearing things, I called back down into the well. Immediately, I heard the boy's voice, calling for help yet again. He wouldn't say anything else, but he sounded so desperate. I figured somebody must have fallen down there. I didn't know what to do. I tried to find some ropes or anything, but I was unable to find something to lower down into the well. All I could think of was try to hurry back to my grandparents' house and try to get some help out that way. I made it back, but didn't really get any help from them. They insisted I had just imagined the whole thing. Back then, and even nowadays, I hate it when people say that. It's so condescending. I know what my imagination is capable of, and it's not capable of imagining an entire camp and a boy stuck in a well. I couldn't get them to help me at all. I took out my phone and called the police. They didn't take me seriously either. They said there were no abandoned camps or wells in that area. Plus, there were no reports of any children missing. They didn't think it was my imagination, though. They thought I was simply pulling a prank on them. I was really worried. I figured I would have to do something on my own. I grabbed some rope and went back out to the river to find that dock so I could get to the camp and rescue the boy. Only trouble was, I was never able to find that dock, no matter how much I searched for it. I thought I could find the camp without it though, so I searched for the camp itself. I could have sworn I knew exactly where everything was, but I couldn't find the camp or the well. They were nowhere to be seen. I eventually gave up on the whole thing and headed back to my grandparents' house. I've never been able to explain it. In the following years, I've often hiked around that area, confident I would one day find that dock, or the camp, or the well. I've never come across any of them. I was also never able to find any information about such a thing online, and there were no missing children reported in the area during that time period. I really have no idea what I experienced that day, but I remember it all so clearly, and I know for a fact it was not my imagination. This is something that happened in the last apartment I lived in. I moved into it in June of 2021 and lived there for about 2 years before moving. After I'd lived there for about a year or so, a new neighbor moved in next door. For some details on the apartment building, it's relatively new and was built, I believe, less than 10 years ago. I lived on the second floor and was right before the last unit on one end of the building. On one end of it, the building just has straight hallways with units on both sides. My apartment had 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a living room, and a kitchen. The new neighbor next door got the very last unit at the end. In my time living there, most of the other neighbors were very friendly and kind. I got to know almost everyone who lived on my floor. The person who'd previously lived next to me was very nice as well. We would talk often and share our stories. A man moved in who didn't seem to be quite as friendly. I talked to him only once, shortly after he moved in. I didn't really see him much after that at all though, maybe like once or twice, but I can't really think of any specific time that I did. About 6 months after the new neighbor guy moved in next door, I was up sort of late one night when I began to hear some pounding on the wall coming from his side. It wasn't that loud because the wall seemed to do well holding sound, but I could hear something. I figured that maybe he was hanging something on the wall and didn't pay it much thought. The next night, though, I was actually woken up by hearing it again, this time a little bit louder. I'm also a light sleeper, though, so I tried to just go back to bed. Eventually I did and didn't really think anything of it. I was woken up again, though, in the middle of the night the very next night. I woke up to some sounds coming from my bathroom area. The bathroom is connected to my bedroom, and the door leading to it was mostly closed. All of the lights were out, so when I looked around, I couldn't really see anything. I was sitting up in bed trying to figure out what it was that I was hearing exactly. I was also a little bit confused, having just woken up. I soon realized, though, what I was hearing was somebody in my bathroom. How they got in, I had no clue. I was sure that I had locked my doors. I started to hear footsteps, and I jumped from my bed. I grabbed my phone, then on the way out grabbed my keys and sprinted out of my apartment. I kept running down the hallway and went down the stairs. When I had made it all the way out to my car, I called up my best friend. Thankfully, she was actually still awake. It was around 1 o'clock in the morning. She let me come over and stay at her place for the rest of the night. The next day, we went back to my apartment and carefully looked around. I was expecting the worst. I thought maybe it would be all messed up and a bunch of my items would have been stolen, but surprisingly, everything was perfectly in place. Nobody was inside the apartment either, and nothing had been taken. I was so confused. I was sure I had heard somebody in there the night before. My friend asked me about everything that happened. As I was telling her, I walked into my bathroom to where I'd initially heard the noise. I realized that the sounds had been coming from near my shower. Next to my shower to the right was a very large storage cabinet. Maybe you might even be able to call it a closet. I didn't use it much at all. I just stored extra towels and blankets in there. That's where I'd heard the noise coming from. I opened it up, and when I did, I saw that some things were actually out of place. When I moved a towel to the side, I saw the wall had a significant crack in it. At least, that's what I thought it was. I hadn't remembered it looking at all like that before. On the other side of the wall was my neighbor, the new guy. That's when I realized that he must have been the one in my apartment. I moved the crack aside a little and realized that a big chunk of the wall had actually been removed. Horrified, I moved away from there as quick as possible, and my friend and I called the police immediately. We called up apartment management as well. They did an investigation, and the man next door admitted to creating a hole in the wall and entering my place. He never said what his intentions were, though. I'm glad I didn't have to deal with him for the last few months I lived there. I ended up moving away when my lease was up. I just couldn't bring myself to live there anymore, not after what happened. I'm really glad I heard the sound when I did and was able to leave my apartment so quickly. This incident happened with my younger sister Sydney just a few months ago. One of her friends, Leia, was celebrating her 21st birthday and invited my sister and 2 other friends, Nancy and Jin, to the celebration. It was actually a girls' night out. They had planned to go for a short drive, have dinner, and end the day with a movie. They were all very eager to watch the particular movie they had planned. Leia had already declared all the expenditure was on her, as it was her throwing this party. She told them she'd booked the movie tickets online beforehand for the 8 p.m. slot. Then, by 10 p.m. or so, they would be heading back home. Everything went as part of the plan, and the 4 girls had an early dinner. At around 7:45, they headed over to the movie theater to catch that movie. That's when they realized that not everything was going as per plan. Leia had not booked the tickets. She claimed there were enough seats available, so she thought booking them at the counter would be much cheaper. My sister thought she might have just forgotten to book them. Anyway, the tickets were sold out, not just for that particular slot, but even the next one as well. The one after that still had plenty of seats though. Debating if they should book the much later one, which was about at 10:30 or so, or just watch it the next day, they decided to watch it that night. After hanging out in the mall for a few hours, they returned for the movie. The movie theater wasn't as vacant as they'd anticipated. There were a few couples and some friends and colleagues, but one group that really stood out consisted of 3 men, mid to late 30s. They were giggling, whistling, and making nasty comments throughout the movie. Nancy highly suspected they must have been stoned. Considering they were sitting a few seats ahead of them, though, they didn't really have to worry about it that much. That is, until about an hour later, Sydney had noticed that the seats were now empty. The men had left somewhere. She soon realized they had shifted a little bit back, a single row of seats separating them now. Again, they thought nothing of it. Weird, but maybe they just wanted a better view. 15 minutes later, Nancy, who was at the end corner, noticed laughter emerging from the other end of the row. There they were, now sitting in the same row as them. Out of all places, why were they moving closer and closer to their group? Leia wasn't really bothered. She told Nancy to chill out and not ruin the movie experience, as in 15 minutes it would all be over and they could just leave anyway. A few minutes passed by and the laughter and whispers from the men had only increased. They'd moved even closer to the girls. This time, though, it wasn't just Nancy that was concerned. Now all the others were as well. Before the credits even rolled, they jumped out of their seats and marched toward the exit. As soon as they were out, they tried booking a cab. Nancy and Jen had shared an apartment, and Sydney lived a few minutes away in the same locality. They planned to share the cab. Then, from Nancy's place, Sydney would walk back to hers. Leia stayed with her folks in the opposite direction. After a bit of a struggle, they managed to book a ride. Leia was unable to, as she couldn't find any riders willing to drive her that far to her destination. They stood on the sidewalk waiting for the ride to arrive. Nancy had spotted the group of men yet again, but fortunately they were on the opposite side of the road. They were also walking in the opposite direction. After 5 minutes their ride arrived, but Leia still couldn't find one. She declared she would just call her big brother to come and pick her up. She didn't really have any other option. She asked the girls to leave, but the girls were reluctant. It wasn't safe to wait there all alone at night, even for 15 minutes. What if that group of guys came back? Leia was sure they were gone at this point, and she was adamant on not going with the others, as it would be farther away from her house. About 2 minutes into the discussion, realizing they couldn't change her mind, they all entered the cab. After they were all inside, Jen informed the others she'd seen the men again behind them this time, and that they were coming from the direction of the movie theater, heading straight toward them. The girls managed to reach Nancy's apartment just fine. After a hectic day, they just wanted to get some sleep. Sydney, too, wanted to get back to her place and relax a bit, but Jen convinced her to stay back so they could play some games until they felt sleepy. Sydney reluctantly agreed to this. She's thankful she did so, because about 10 minutes after they entered the apartment, they began to hear a loud music from outside. When they looked over to the window and peeped through the curtains, what they saw gave them chills. There was a car just a little ahead of their apartment gate, stopped near the streetlight. 2 men emerged from it, and she was absolutely positive that it was 2 of the same men they'd seen previously. They all switched off the lights, then peeped through the curtains. At first, the road was deserted, but not long after, they saw the 3 men walking down the road, their car nowhere to be found. The men were all laughing and talking loudly, and were also looking around and scanning the buildings. This was not a coincidence. They were literally stalking the group of girls. Maybe they'd even tailed their car there. They couldn't find the exact apartment they'd gone to, though. As you can imagine, they were all terrified. Someone suggested calling the cops, but the others weren't as sure. They didn't have any proof of the men following them. A few minutes passed when they heard sirens and saw a police patrol vehicle. This made the men panic. and they sprinted in the other direction, then hopped into their car, which was hidden in an alleyway, and sped away. The police actually chased them. We weren't sure if they were ever caught. It was later discovered that some neighbor had already called the cops on them. Fortunately, they were never seen again in the locality, but that was the last time they ever went to see a late-night movie. It just wasn't worth the risk after that awful experience. I don't care how old I get. I love taking vacations with my family. I'm in my early 30s now, and I still look forward to going away with them every year. It's even more enjoyable now, actually, because my brother and I bring our families as well. Of all the years we ever went on a trip together, only 1 year did I have an experience that was less than stellar. When I was in my early 20s, can't quite remember the exact year, we took a trip to Maine. This was probably the last vacation I went on with my family, where it was just my brother and I and no girlfriends. This was the first vacation where we didn't go away to some beach town, which I was totally okay with. I love the ocean and the beach, but sometimes it just gets crazy in the summer. I was really looking forward to a relaxing getaway in a secluded Maine town. Before arriving at the house rental, I only had the pictures to go by, and let me tell you, the place looked incredible. When we were pulling into the long driveway, the pictures were becoming a reality. It was a giant white house, tucked way back into the woods. There was a huge wraparound porch that wrapped around all the way to the back of the home. The porch in the back overlooked a body of water, I believe a river of some sort, that actually flowed into the ocean. When we arrived, we were greeted by a man named Henry, an older man who seemed very friendly. He was the owner of the home, just letting us know he lived right up the road, and if we needed anything, we could call him at any time and he'd be right down. I noticed right away that everyone in Maine seemed to be incredibly friendly. Maybe it's just because I'm from New York, but I felt like every person I talked to while I was there was incredibly happy and pleasant to be around. The first day and evening were quite great. We ran into our first issue that first night before heading to sleep, though. We noticed that none of the doors had locks. The front door was an older wooden door with these worn-out metal doorknobs that didn't contain any sort of lock at all. The back house had all windows that overlooked that body of water, and at the end of the windows was a sliding door. No lock on that door either. We were a bit creeped out, but kinda shrugged it off. My dad said he would talk to Henry in the morning and try to figure out a solution. Morning came, and my dad and I walked down to Henry's house. My dad voiced his concerns and inquired about how to go about locking down the house at night. Henry laughed like he'd just heard the funniest joke of all time. "Brother, this is Maine. We don't lock our doors in Maine." My dad and I looked at each other, and my dad continued speaking with Henry. Basically, the conversation went nowhere, and we just made peace with the fact we wouldn't be locking our doors during our trip. A few nights passed by, and I have to be totally honest, I wasn't sleeping very well. Maybe I'm just a paranoid person, but knowing the doors were unlocked was giving me huge anxiety. One night, I heard a weird noise coming from outside the bedroom I was sleeping in. My brother and I were sharing a room. Since it was a huge room, it had multiple beds. Because my brother was only a few feet away, I woke him up and asked him if he could hear that strange noise as well. He was annoyed that he was awoken at first, but admitted that he could also hear something quite strange. I got up and slowly opened the bedroom door and started to make my way down the hall to the kitchen. I noticed there was a light on above the stove, and this didn't sit right with me. I was always the last one to go to bed, and I knew this light had not been on when I went to my bedroom for the night. I didn't completely freak out, though. After all, it was possible one of my parents had woken up and grabbed a drink of water or something. I continued to tiptoe through the kitchen and make my way to the living room. Even though it was pitch black outside, the moon was very bright, so I was able to slightly see out the windows. I scanned every window, and I swore I could see someone running by. I jumped back and gasped out loud. I ducked down and continued looking at the windows. I didn't see anything now. Was it possible my eyes were playing tricks on me? I swore I saw someone back there. I told my brother, who basically told me to just shut up and go to sleep. He was convinced the noises were just the house settling, and my imagination was tricking me into thinking I actually saw someone out there. Nothing happened for the next couple of nights. On the last night, I could hear the strange noises again though. This time, I quietly snuck out of my room and looked down the hall. I caught someone running out of the house, closing the sliding door in the living room. This time, I knew I saw someone. I woke up the entire house and told them someone had been inside. They honestly didn't seem to believe me. My dad still called Henry, even though it was in the middle of the night. He told him I had seen someone in the house and asked if we should call the police. Henry said he'd already called them and he was going to head over to the house right away to make sure we were okay. Well, when Henry walked in, I felt sick to my stomach. I'd only caught a glimpse of the guy fleeing from our house, but Henry was wearing the exact same thing as him. I didn't speak up, but writing it down now, I kind of wish I did. The police showed up and my dad and Henry spoke to them. I don't know what they said or did, but it didn't matter too much to us since we were leaving in just a few hours anyway. Thankfully, nothing happened for the rest of the night. As I write this down now, I'm 100% confident that the person I saw in the house that night and the person I must have seen outside before was Henry. I don't have any evidence to back that up. I have no idea what he was doing or if he planned on doing anything. It's possible he was just some creep who liked to spy on people voyeuristically. Either way, I'm happy it's a distant memory now. After that trip, I'm happy to stick in with just the simple beach towns instead. A few years back, I got a new phone with a new number and everything. When I did, I called my best friend. I was pretty sure that I knew her number by heart and had memorized it completely. Calling her was just about the first thing I did when I got my new phone. Right as I heard someone pick up the phone, I said hello, but to my surprise, the person on the other end was a man I didn't recognize. I asked if this was my friend's number, and the person said no. I realized I probably had the wrong number and told them that. The guy got very irate though. He said something like, "No, who is this calling?" I just said sorry again and then hung up. I looked back at the number I had dialed and realized it was in fact wrong. I had mixed up one of the numbers. Everything else was correct though. I then called my friend, but as I was talking to her, I got a call from another number. It was the first guy who I'd called accidentally. He was calling me back for some reason. I ignored it and talked to my friend for about 10 minutes or so. The guy tried calling multiple times during the call. Later that day, he tried to call me 5 more times at least. I ignored all of them, but he just wouldn't stop calling me. He kept calling, so finally I answered it. The man on the other end acted like he hadn't been blowing up my phone all day and night. He casually asked me what was going on and how I was doing. I asked him why the hell he kept calling me, and he flat out ignored my question. Needless to say, I got a little bit mad and hung up on him after that. Then I blocked his number. Now I wouldn't have to worry about this strange guy contacting me ever again. Or so I thought. Just the next day, I got a text from a brand new number. "Why did you block me?" I asked who this was. I really didn't need to, though. I knew who it must be. The guy who kept calling me. He'd probably just made an account on one of those free texting call apps or whatever. He texted me back, confirming what I already knew. I went ahead and blocked this number as well. This didn't stop him though. Whoever this guy was, he was very determined. A new number started calling me repeatedly later that day. I couldn't believe this guy was still trying to contact me. He just wouldn't give up. I texted this new number, asking him to stop harassing me, but he did not, obviously. Each time I would block the number, a new one would appear. He would call me 10 times a day and just wouldn't leave me alone. This went on for more than an entire week. I decided then that I was just going to get a new number. I only had my current number for about a week or so, and this guy would not leave me alone. After I was able to change numbers again, I was finally left unbothered. I'm sure that guy probably kept calling and texting my old number. If somebody else ended up getting that number, I feel really sorry for them, especially when the guy must have found out it wasn't me. Hopefully, he just let them alone. I still can't believe the sheer efforts he went through to get to me, though. I'm glad it didn't get even worse than that. This happened when I was in high school. I don't exactly remember how old I was, but I know I was a teenager. I'm part of a family of 9. Yeah, it's a pretty big family, I know. We all lived together in a detached house at the time. I don't really know how to cut to the chase in any other way than saying in a family of that size, it's inevitable there's a queue sometimes for the bathroom. In the morning, 7 a.m. in my house was like Shinjuku Station during rush hour. It was always busy though. We lived with it and it was just our lifestyle. One night during dinner, my mom said something a little bit strange. She said that morning the light in the bathroom had been on. She needed to use it, so she called out to see if anyone was in there, and someone replied that they were. My mom said she wasn't sure if it was my younger brother or my little sister, so she called out both their names to see if she could find out. She waited a little while, but no one replied. She said she was a little concerned by that silence, so she went to unlock the door. When she opened the door, though, she found it unlocked already, and she couldn't believe her eyes. The bathroom was completely empty, and no one was in there. She was completely adamant, though, that she'd heard someone's voice coming from the bathroom. I wasn't surprised when she told me she got the chills after that experience. Of course, my dad just shook it off and said she must have been imagining or hearing things. I guess that could be a possibility. We did live in a noisy home, and when it was quiet, sometimes it just didn't sound or feel right. I suppose that sounds a little weird, but it is true. My siblings agreed with my dad, said it must have been a street noise or the neighbor's dog, a TV being on in another room or something. I allowed them to sway me and convince me as well. A couple of days after, I'd kind of forgotten the incident even happened. One morning, a little while later, I was getting ready to go to school, and I needed to use the bathroom. It was just a standard morning in a family of 9. I saw the light was already on inside, so I called out, "Is someone in there?" I could hear the sound of a newspaper being unrolled, and I heard my father's voice say, "Yeah, I'm in here." I thought to myself, why are you reading the damn paper in there? You know how busy it is in the morning. I rattled the door handle and told him to hurry up. However, as I rattled the door, it opened by itself. It was not locked at all. I opened the door fully to reveal an empty bathroom. I was really creeped out by that sight. I was freaking out because I knew I had just heard my dad respond to me from in there. I feel as if I could pass a lie detector test on that. In my mind, it was so clear. I was certain he was in there, only when I checked, no one was. I didn't know what to do, obviously. I quickly left my home. I didn't want to use the bathroom at home that day. and decided to just use the one at school. I couldn't believe the same thing that had happened to my mom just happened to me. I'm sure of what I heard. I'm sure it wasn't street noise or some TV, and I know it sure as hell wasn't the neighbor's dog making that noise. That night, while we were all having dinner, I mentioned what happened that morning to my family. My sister was shocked because she said she'd also heard my father's voice in the bathroom directly after I'd left for school. And that just freaked me out even more. It was seriously weird. There was something in our house trying to mimic the voices of my family members by the sound of things. If that's not it, then I don't really know how else to explain it. It happened on a bright morning in a family home that had no history as far as I know of paranormal activity. It really creeped me out, and I don't know what that was at all. I still live at home there, but I'll be moving out as soon as I can. I've heard voices in the night coming from across the hall that sound like my siblings talking in quiet conversations. Sometimes I can't get myself to sleep because I don't know if I'm really listening to my brothers and sisters muttering at night or if it's the same thing that talked to me before. This happened on my 23rd birthday. I'm now 45, and I live in Michigan. This happened early January. I was prepping for a night out with my girl and cleaning up, since we normally have parties in my house. My son was home since I was dropping him off on our way out. He was 4 at the time, and I was a single mom. I went to take out my trash, and I had left my door open a small crack, since I was heading out soon. Big mistake. Keep in mind this was not the best area. All of a sudden I heard my son say, "Mom, someone's here." That alone caught my attention. His voice sounded odd. I looked over and saw a man who had a mask on and a dark hoodie covering his head. He yelled out, "I got a gun. Give me all your money." I had literally just gotten paid on this day, so my first thought was to distract him. My purse was in my dining room downstairs. I told him it was upstairs, though. I lived in a townhouse at the time. He grabbed me by my shirt and ripped off my chain. Well, that really pissed me off. At that point, I had not actually seen his gun. I decided to fight him. Looking back, that was probably a terrible idea. He got some good blows in on me, but I really hurt him too. My son was now crying and screaming. My front door was still open. I punched the guy as hard in his neck as I could, and then pushed him out the front door. He literally went flying down my front stairs. I ran outside, screaming and yelling for help. A cop just so happened to be driving by and asked what was going on. I told him, and the man took off running. It was winter. They tracked him down and caught him easily. He went to jail, but didn't do any serious time really. He was released soon. About a year later, I was walking into a grocery store when I saw the very same guy. My heart stopped, and I immediately grabbed my son and walked out. I followed up with the court, and they claimed they had sent me a notice, but of course I never got it. About 6 months later, he was on the front page of the local newspaper as he had killed someone. He's now serving 55 years. If they had just put him away for what he did to my son and I, a life would have been saved. I do still check on him occasionally, just to make sure he's still locked up. I was street smart, but this put me on edge for years. I would sleep with a knife in my front door until I met my husband, who finally allowed me to relax and trust again. I'm still so grateful to him. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to my story, and please stay safe. About 2 years ago, maybe a little bit more, I got out of a long-term relationship. Being that I'm the shy type, I wasn't good at asking girls out, and for some reason it gave me crippling anxiety. I'm not sure if it was the fear of rejection or the embarrassment of my peers, But either way, dating was not my strong suit. When I met my ex, Tinder was just becoming a thing, so I never used the app. Now that I was single, I had a chance to try it out for myself. I must admit, I was excited. I know a lot of my friends have had success on Tinder and various other dating platforms. I had the app for a few months, and nothing exciting happened. I did meet one girl at the park, but that date lasted all of 20 minutes. She did the classic phone call move, saying she had gotten called into work, and then I never heard from her again. I was just about to consider the Tinder experiment a failure when I matched up with Danielle. Danny for short. She was beautiful. I was half expecting that I was actually being played. Actually, at one point, I thought for sure this girl was a 50-year-old dude or something. I continued to talk to her anyway, though, and we agreed to meet at the local park in our area. The park is a beautiful place. There's a big lake in the middle and a massive series of trails that go all around the lake. We agreed to meet at 5 p.m. when we both got off of work. I showed up at 4 o'clock because I was so nervous. I waited around until I got her message, a little bit after 5. She messaged saying she was walking to the pavilion area where all the picnic tables were. I messaged her back and told her I was heading that way as well. Needless to say, I was beyond happy when I walked to the pavilion and sitting right in front of me was actually Danny, the same Danny from Tinder, and not a 50-year-old man. I sat down and we talked for quite a while. She had this way of calming me down and making me not be so nervous. Whatever she was saying and doing, it really worked. I was head over heels for this girl already. I thought that I may have been doing a good job on the date, since it had been a few hours now and she hadn't decided to leave yet. We decided to go for a walk on one of the trails, even though it was starting to get dark out. Ordinarily, I would have never agreed to do this, but I felt alright with Danny for some reason. I reached for her hand at one point and nearly melted into myself when she allowed me to hold it. For the first time, I felt something special. We walked for a long time until it was dark, and she suggested we turn around and start making our way back to our cars. We had no idea how much longer this trail went on for, and it was almost pitch black out now. The walk back was quite nice for a while. Danny was holding my hand and cuddling up against my arm. We weren't far from the lot when I noticed somebody standing in the walkway. I could barely see him, and if it wasn't for the faint light of the moon shining through the trees, I would have probably missed him altogether. I stopped abruptly and asked Danny if she could see him too. She said she could, and shouted and asked the guy if he needed any help. The person just stood there, not doing anything. I was terrified, but I didn't want to seem too scared in front of her. I suggested that we move. It was probably just some fool trying to play a joke on us. We slowly continued walking toward the person. As they became more visible, it was becoming more scary. The figure hadn't budged an inch. Now we could clearly see that he was concealing something behind his back. When we were about 10 feet away, the man finally moved his hands from behind his back, and in his hand appeared to be a knife. I wasn't sure with how dark it was, though. In a low and rough voice, the man commanded us, "Turn around and put your hands above your head." I had no idea what to do. Danny, being the little spitfire she is, started to argue with the man. Before I could even realize what was happening, she shoulder-charged into him and knocked him over. She yelled at me to run. I did so, and could hear the man running after us as we made our way off the trail. We both ran to her car. She got into the passenger side, and I drove off. I could see the man in the parking lot as we were departing from the park. My car was there too, along with 3 other cars. That made me think, was this guy alone, or were there more people in danger in that park? When we were a safe distance away, we called the police and reported what happened. The man was obviously long gone, and the only car in the lot when the police arrived was my vehicle. I remember distinctly having the thought at one point that Danny might have been setting me up or something. but thankfully her apparent heroic action put that thought to bed. After that horrifying event, we went to a late-night dinner and stayed up all night talking. That event somehow brought us closer together. In a lot of ways, I had mixed feelings about the Tinder app. It almost got me killed, but I also met Danny there, and now she's my fiancée. Whenever I tell people how we met, it's always funny to watch the reactions of people when we tell them that we met on Tinder and almost died on our very first date. I still can't believe what she did that night, and that we were actually able to get out of there unharmed. It just goes to show you, sometimes good things really can come out of the bad. A few months ago, I was bored at work one day. When I don't have as much to do, I just go on my phone or browse the internet on my computer. Sometimes I go on Craigslist and look at cars or other things for sale. One day, I had about an hour until I got off work and had nothing more to do. I went on Craigslist and noticed the missed connections section. I clicked on it just for fun because I thought it might be an amusing read. This is a section on Craigslist, by the way, where people will post about if they saw somebody and maybe had a conversation with them in public or something. It's for if they didn't get the person's name or any information, they reach out and try to contact them. That's why it's called misconnections, obviously. The whole idea just seems sort of weird to me. I clicked on a few and read them all. On like the fourth or fifth one, I saw one that seemed like the person was talking about me. The ad said blonde female, then mentioned the name of the city I live and work in. When I clicked on the ad, it said, "I saw you walking on your street last Thursday night. Saw you again at Target the next day, wearing a Braves hat. Let me know if I can come over sometime." This really shocked me. Not only had I gone for a walk in my neighborhood Thursday night, but I had also been in Target the next day as well, wearing a Braves hat. It made me a little bit suspicious. The fact the person had seen me in two places. Were they stalking me? That's what was going through my head immediately. But maybe it was just someone who happened to live in my neighborhood, and it was a pure coincidence. They were definitely describing me. I knew that for a fact, but I decided not to answer the ad. I finished up work for the day and then went home. I lived by myself in a smaller house on a fairly busy street. One of my best friends, Avery, came over after work. We would hang out quite a bit. After she came over, I told her about the strange Craigslist ad and decided to show it to her. I got on my laptop and logged on. When I got on the missed connections part, I saw there was now a new post. The title said Blonde Woman in My City Yet Again, Part 2. This post was very recent. In fact, it had been made less than an hour earlier. It said, "I saw you leaving work today. Hope you see one of these ads and get back to me." Avery and I looked at each other in shock. This was very crazy. This post indicated that whoever it was possibly stalking me. We both ran to all the windows and looked out into the street, just in case this guy was out there somewhere, but we didn't see anything out of place. I had never noticed anyone watching me. My work parking lot is pretty large though, and had lots of other cars in it. It would have been easy for somebody to hide there without being caught. For the next couple of days, I was extremely worried. I checked Craigslist multiple times, but there were no new posts about me. I paid close attention to my surroundings, but never noticed anything out of the ordinary. I suppose it would have been difficult though unless it was fairly obvious. It never seemed like I was being followed or anything like that. One day, when I got home from work, I was moving from my kitchen to the living room. When I got into the living room, I saw a car parked in front of my house. I went up to the window and looked out to see if I recognized it. I did not. No more than 10 seconds later, I saw the car drive away. I didn't get a good look at the driver. The very next day, when I was on my way home from work, about halfway back, a car started to drive behind me. This was the same car I had seen in front of my house. I got a bad feeling, and the car made the same 3 turns in a row that I made. I feared it would follow me all the way back home, but when I got to the turn right before my street, the car went the other direction, and I was able to make it home without seeing the car again. I decided then that I would respond to one of the ads. I could not take this anymore. When I got home, I got into my laptop and contacted the person. I asked them why they were seemingly stalking me and asked them to please leave me alone. After I sent the message, I hoped the person would either reply and have an explanation or actually just leave me alone. I waited and went on with the day. Several hours later at 9 p.m. or so, I checked again. There was no response from the person. I closed my laptop and went into the living room. That's when I noticed the same car out front again. It was parked in the same spot it had been before. I went over to the window and looked closer. I saw nobody appear to be inside. That's when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye to the right. I looked over and saw a man in my front yard, at the far side of it by the driveway. He was walking up toward my door. I was terrified. I didn't waste any time. I ran away from the window, got out my cell phone and called the police. As I was waiting for the operator to answer the phone, I heard the man try to enter my front door, followed by a soft knocking. I ran into my bedroom and closed the door. I told the 911 operator what was going on, and then just had to wait. I did my best not to listen outside my room because I didn't even want to know what was going on. About 15 minutes later, the police arrived. The most unbelievable part is that when they got there, the man was actually still there. He was in my backyard, and they found him trying to get in through a back window. Well, I was certainly glad I'd called when I did. I showed the police everything and told them about all the things that happened. It seemed like the man had been stalking me for a while. I guess that when I asked him to leave me alone, he felt like he had to take matters into his own hands. Since that happened, I moved away and now have an apartment across town. I also haven't been on Craigslist at all. The strangest and creepiest thing that's ever happened to me in my life happened when I was back in my hometown to visit my parents last summer. I met up with some of my friends from school and spent some good time with my parents. After a couple of days, though, I ended up sat down on the veranda with nothing much to do. I grew up in the countryside, and nowadays I live in a big city. It was really nice to come back and take in a bit of nature. Summers are always really pleasant in my hometown. That afternoon, there was a gentle breeze sweeping through the rice fields that our veranda looked out onto. The cicadas were chirping in the distance, and I was thinking about how we didn't really hear much of them in the city. Just for some context, my parents' home is in the Fukushima prefecture. It's such a rural place that sometimes you can see wild bears out the window. It's really peaceful. I laid there on the deck chair and shut my eyes. The warm sunlight felt nice against my eyelids. It was so relaxing, so what happened next really seemed inevitable. I fell asleep in my chair. I woke up after an unknown period of time. I had this exact thought in my mind. Huh? What's this? Something feels ticklish. I first thought it might be a bug. I hate bugs, so I opened my eyes. Needless to say, I was shocked to see an old woman who I'd never seen before, holding my arm and rubbing it. She looked to be in her 70s or 80s and was wearing a really dirty-looking tattered kimono. So dirty I couldn't even make out what the original color was supposed to be. She was looking downward at my arm. I couldn't make out her face. I thought to myself, what the heck are you doing? Stop it! It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe this total stranger had entered our property to grab me and rub my skin while I slept. I felt gross and frightened, to be honest with you. Those two feelings after waking up are very hard to process. With that in mind, you might understand my next actions. I was groggy as my brain began to throw itself into gear. I knew I needed to get this woman off me, but I found I couldn't coax the words out of my throat to speak to her. All I heard myself produce was a very hoarse and wordless groan. Moreover, I found I couldn't move my body at all. I couldn't shove her away. It was like my brain's waves weren't reaching my limbs. This had never happened to me before or since then. I heard the strange old woman begin to speak, and the phrase she kept repeating had constantly creeped me out whenever I remember. I love soft things, especially when it's young skin. It didn't make much sense, but she kept on repeating it. I love it, especially when it's young skin. Get off me, you hag! I wanted to scream, but the words still wouldn't come out. My arms and legs continued to disobey me too. I was straining as hard as I could to get away from this woman, so much so that sweat began to gather on my forehead. She muttered something about how young skin was so irresistible. I couldn't do anything about her. I hated it and was disgusted by what was happening. The old woman then began to turn her head and attention away from my arm. She slowly raised her head to meet my gaze, while raising my arm slowly towards my face. That was the moment I got a good look at her face. I can still see it in my mind sometimes, usually whenever I'm in a dark place or something. Her face was so swollen that all the features were barely distinguishable. Her eyes were almost closed. She was spewing a mixture of blood and foam from her mouth down onto my arm. I couldn't handle it anymore. I don't know exactly what happened, but I'm assuming I fainted. It was like my brain went into safe mode. Next thing I knew, I woke up, and it was already dark outside. I was still out on the veranda. My parents were saying something to me. The first thing I felt was an intense burning sensation, a feeling of pain. I figured out what my parents were saying. They were asking me what happened to me. It was all very alarming. I didn't even think about the old woman at that point. All I could focus on was the pain. I looked down toward the area of pain in my arm and saw that some of my skin had been peeled away, and there were various cuts and scratches. My arm was covered in blood, and there was no sign of the old woman. She definitely left with a piece of my skin. I have no explanation for what happened that summer afternoon. I know that's something that people often say when they feel something very strange has happened, but I honestly completely mean it. I can't understand what happened to me on that afternoon. I don't know if that woman was real or if it was some kind of sleep paralysis or hallucination, maybe even a ghost or something more sinister like a demon. I've been back to my parents' house since then, but I do not go anywhere near that veranda anymore. By the way, I got myself fixed up at the hospital and told them I wanted some antibiotics just to be safe. I hope it was just a hallucination, but even if it was, then how did my skin get cut and peeled off? And why was my arm covered with blood? It turns my stomach to even think about this. Like I said, it was the scariest thing that ever happened to me, and I pray I never see that old hag again. I used to be a janitor for a high school. It was a job that I only had for about a year. This was back in 2019. The job itself was not too bad, but I moved on to other things later. For the most part, when I worked as a janitor, I would work overnights in the high school. I was typically all by myself. I would start at 9 o'clock at night and get off at 5 in the morning. The high school was large, but not so big that I couldn't manage it. With all that time and the whole place to myself, I could clean everything that I was supposed to a few times over. Due to events on school campus, there were often some people still around by the time I started, but they would usually all be gone within an hour or two. I would do the things that you would expect to do: mop the floors, vacuum, sweep, maintain the bathrooms. Not every room in the school required attention daily, So it's not like I was cleaning every single classroom every single night either. I would have a lot of downtime where I would just go on my phone or do whatever I wanted really. It was honestly a really decent job. The only downside was that I had to turn into a nocturnal creature and work overnights. I had to sleep during the day. Another thing that could be considered a downside was that I had to do it all by myself, and I had to spend all night in the school, which sometimes felt sort of creepy. Most of the lights would be off by then, and a lot of them were motion detected. A single area would light up when I got near them. One night I was working in a random hallway, cleaning the floors. It was about midnight or 1 a.m. I think. Suddenly, I thought I could hear footsteps coming from not that far away. I looked over, but I didn't see anything immediately. The footsteps might not have been from someone in my sight though. Maybe they were coming around the corner. It was hard to tell. I walked over, wondering if another person was here. As far as I knew, I was supposed to be all by myself at this time of night. I made it to the end of the hallway and looked around. I didn't see anything out of the usual. I went back over to where I'd been and continued with my work. Maybe I had just imagined it. I wasn't 100% sure. They hadn't been super loud or anything. About 10 minutes later, I began to hear footsteps again though. This time, I knew for sure I was hearing it. I looked over at the end of the hallway and was surprised when this time I saw a man walking by. I only saw him for a couple of seconds because he walked past that hall and down to another. In the short time he was visible, I could tell that it was a grown adult though. Beyond that, I couldn't make out any details. He was kind of far away. I started walking over. I called out asking who was there. Nobody was supposed to be here at this time. Of course, the man didn't answer me. When I got to the end of the hallway and looked around, he was gone. There were other hallways he could have gone down though. I walked a little ways farther in, looking around and calling out to see if anybody was there. If they were, they weren't keen on responding to me. After that, I wasn't really sure what to do. I ended up going back to work, where I had been. Some time went by, and eventually I moved down another hallway. It was probably 3 hours or so after the last time I'd seen the guy. Something else happened. This time I was facing the end of the hallway, when out of nowhere I heard a noise from behind me. I couldn't really tell what it was. I turned around and saw a basketball rolling in my direction. It went past me and hit a locker. When I looked up to where it had been rolled in from, I didn't see anybody. I suspected that whoever was in the building stood at the end of the hallway I was in and rolled the ball toward me, then moved out of sight. Why they would do that, I had no idea. I picked up the ball and walked to the end of the hall, where it had clearly been rolled from. I called out once more, asking if anybody was there. Still, nobody answered me. I stood there in silence, looking around for 5 minutes. I didn't see or hear anything at all. Somebody was clearly messing with me, but why would they do that? I mean, they weren't even supposed to be here in the first place. Once more, I went back to work. From that point on, I wasn't bothered again for the rest of my shift. When I was finishing up, just before I was done, I decided to walk all around the school to look for this person. I went into every wing and hallway and asked if anybody was there in each one of them. I even checked all the bathrooms. Nobody ever answered me, and I didn't see anyone either. At 5 in the morning, I got off. Another janitor arrived. I told him about what happened and asked him to keep an eye out for anyone suspicious. I then left the school and drove home. During this time, I was living in a small house by myself, about 10 minutes away from the school. I arrived back. My typical routine was to go to bed and get some sleep. It was strange to go to sleep at 6 a.m., but I'd gotten used to it. On this day, it was 5 minutes after I got back home. I was in my kitchen when I heard a knock at my front door. Instantly, I was confused. I walked over to the living room and looked out the front window. Nobody was there. As I looked a bit closer, though, I could see that off in the distance, a guy was walking down the street away from my house. I saw him for just a second or two before he ducked out of sight. It looked like the same guy who'd been in the school earlier. I was so creeped out, I couldn't fall asleep for hours. Luckily, the man never returned, and after that day, nothing like that ever happened in the school again. I still wonder who that man was and why he was doing all that. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.